So it's a twin story of demographics and geography. So in the world before 1945, if you had iron ore and coal and oil and food, you could industrialize and make something of yourself. And if you failed to have all four of those things, then you were probably a colony, because they would be industrialized, you would not, and they would be bringing guns to knife fights. And that is the entirety of the story of the British Empire. In 1945, things changed because the Americans found themselves in a world they didn't recognize. We were in Europe at the end of the war, and we saw Stalinist Russia, and we didn't like it. We're like, holy crap, we do not want to go up against that by ourselves. So we needed bodies, lots and lots of bodies, to stand up and stand between us and the Soviets. No one wanted to do that because World War II sucked for everybody in Europe. So we basically had to come up with an inducement. And the solution was free trade and globalization.
Access to the American market.
Access to the American market, access to global resources. Because it used to be that if you were industrialized and you had a navy, then you could control the flow to this or that mineral or energy source or food source. And if you didn't, you were probably a pre-industrialized subsistence agriculture environment. And that was no fun at all. But now everyone didn't need those four things. They only needed one of them, and they could trade for the rest. And so we all started to develop, and that meant we all started to move into cities. And when you move into cities, kids go from being a free resource and free labor to a really, really expensive conversation piece. And we had fewer of them. And so the population structure started to age in a way it hadn't before. So if you think of a pre-industrial population like a pyramid, lots of children at the bottom, few retirees at the top, it started to open up into a chimney. Child mortality wasn't as bad, people would live longer. And we had this nice period in the advanced world from roughly 1950 to roughly 2000, when instead of having a pyramid, we had a column. Not too many children relative to the total, not too many retirees relative to the total, but a lot of people in their 20s and 30s and 40s who would consume, 40s, 50s, and 60s who would produce. And it was the fastest economic growth the world has ever seen. In 1990, globalization was kind of thrown open to everybody, and everyone else joined in, the Chinese, the Brazilians, the Russians, and everything. And they went down that path a lot faster than we had. And so the transformation that we did in 2 or 3 generations, they did in 1 and 2. Well, we're now on the other side of that. After decades of rapid aging, we're not just running out of children. That was 20 to 40 years ago. We're now running out of working age adults. At the same time that the Americans, 30 years on from the Cold War, have really lost interest in maintaining the global system. So we're losing the strategic rationale for globalization. At the same time, the economic rationale is dissolving, because if you don't have enough young people to consume, there's no point in trading in the first place. So this was always the decade where it was all going to break down. It was just a question of the specifics of the order and just how fast it could happen. And what we're seeing with the degradation of the Chinese system in the Ukraine war is it can happen pretty fast. So everybody started the industrialization process at their own pace and at their own time and from different starting points. And as a rule, if you have a lot more elbow room, a lot more small towns and arable farmland, the transition was slower because the economic need to move from the urban or into the urban environments the pressure wasn't as great. And so in places with a lot of space where the weather is broadly positive, like the United States, that process has been really slow. In fact, while industrialization really got going after 1945, technically the US started the process back in the 18th century. So for us, this has been a 7-8 generation process, and it's been relatively gentle. But the Germans became majority urbanized as early as 1900. And then in the post-World War II environment, when they could import food so they didn't have to eat their own crappy food, everyone moved into the cities. And it's by far the most urban environment outside of places like Singapore. So there it's much faster. The Chinese didn't start really until the 70s.
Right.
And so you've got the least productive farmland in the world with the most input intensive, with rice farming, which gives you the highest rate of fatalities just from the process of doing it. Everyone got out of the rice paddies as soon as they could. And now they all live in high rises. And so there they went from having 6 and 7 kids to less than 1 in a single generation. So the top of the list in terms of losers is by far China. We now know that the Chinese demographic situation is so poor that maintaining a national constitution is not possible past this decade. And so we're looking at a complete disintegration of that system in the short period. Korea is probably number 2, very, very rapidly aging. Started in the 50s, but so fast. Germany and Italy are probably 3 and 4 for similar reasons. But on the other side, you've got countries like the United States who've got a lot of elbow room, who have managed to keep their birth rates high. Sweden is on that list. France is on that list. Argentina is on that list. And then there's some countries in the middle where the urbanization is quick, but it's happened so relatively recently that it just hasn't had a chance to really dig in, and it might even be reversible. And that's your Indias, your Indonesias, your Mexicos, and your Brazils. Key thing to remember is that there is no Canada. Canada is not a real place. It's not a real country. It is 10 provinces that have their own sets of rules and their own trade relationships, each one of which trades more with the United States than they do with the rest of Canada. I don't mean that to say that that is a bug. That is a feature, because it makes the provinces a lot more dynamic and functional when there are changes in environment. So, number one, don't think about what is good for Canada. Think about what is good or bad for Ontario or Quebec or BC or Alberta. There is no unit. You guys didn't even get an internal free trade agreement until 2-3 years ago. So the future we're moving into is one where we're going to lose a significant amount of energy production out of the Russian space and out of the Persian Gulf. So in that environment, anyone who is a stable energy provider can kind of write their own check. Alberta is, with Texas, at the very top of the list in terms of regional systems that are going to do very well. That's number one. Number two, we're seeing a breakdown in the trade system that allows global fertilizer to be produced. In North America, that does not apply. North America makes all of its own nitrogen fertilizer. Saskatchewan produces almost all of our potash fertilizer, and we can get phosphate from some places within North America, but certainly within the Western Hemisphere.
Right.
So in a world where global food production gets hit hard, North American producers are fine. And the crop that is going to see the most dynamic change in pricing is wheat, because wheat is only grown in places where nothing else will grow.
Because it'll grow almost anywhere comparatively, yeah.
But we've pushed it to the margin, so it will only grow in places where only wheat can grow with industrial inputs. So if you break down the industrial inputs, most wheat production around the world is going to fail, or it will have to be relocated to better land. That does not apply to North America. So if you want to talk about the crop that is going to see just explosive increases in prices, that's wheat, and that's a story for North Dakota and for Kansas and for the prairies.
Right.
So to be kind of at this nexus and to be the most capital-rich city in Canada, these are good things. So if Alberta does nothing different at all, you're going to be one of the fastest growing parts of the world for the next 30 years. Everything is upside potential. Food supplier, absolutely. There's no reason to expect that will change. Energy supplier, you've never been considered an energy supplier to the world. You're an energy supplier to North America.
To the United States.
There's a difference, yes. And the questions that the Japanese and the Germans had, they were not coming to Canada because they thought it was going to be a slam dunk. They were coming to Canada because it's a Hail Mary. There are no places in the world that can easily step into Russia's shoes from the European or the Asian point of view. And honestly, I don't think the Germans or the Japanese were very hopeful when they arrived in the first place, because let's be honest, you are not a country, you are 10 provinces, which means for Albertan crude to get out, it has to either run
through British Columbia.
Oh my God. I mean, the BCers,
we're about to get a new pipeline there with the Trans Mountain expansion.
I would not hold your breath on that one, because just because the federal government has kind of given in to allow it to happen, the political coalition that is supporting the minority government is not in favor of that. And the federal government is unlikely to do anything, even when it's built, to make sure it can operate. So all of the protest groups, especially the BC government, which is one of the protest groups, are going to do everything they can to stymie that pipeline from the day it's finished. So I wouldn't count on that one. And then if you're going east, oh my God, it's like BC on steroids in order to get it off to the East Coast.
Right. And especially Quebec has said that they're very, very uninterested in any future pipelines.
And even then, if you can get the natural gas to the coast, you then have to build an LNG liquefaction facility. No one has ever built one of those in less than 5 years. So when Japan and Germany were like, they were kind of hoping against hope that something would happen, but it was hoping against hope. There is no way to fix their problems with LNG in the midterm.
How will they fix their problems, or how can they fix their problems?
I'm not too concerned about Japan. So Japan, series of very rocky volcanic islands, and most of the urban centers are not physically connected. So each urban center has to have its own ground up energy infrastructure. And they know that if they rely on one commodity or fuel source, that if something happens with that market, they're screwed. So every single urban center has a coal burning power plant, an LNG burning power plant, a nuclear power plant, and sometimes some alternative stuff that even includes wood. And they don't need them all. They only need one or two of them to work.
To meet their power needs.
Exactly. And so they even have oil burning, which is like only like Lebanon burns oil anymore. And so for them, it would have been nice to have another supplier, but they have other options and they don't need them all. And remember that because of their demographic situation and their deindustrialization, the Japanese don't use nearly as much energy as they used to. They used to take 5 million barrels a day. Now it's like 3.25. So they have a lot of overbuilding in their power sector that gives them a lot of flexibility, and they can tap the Western Hemisphere in a way that the Germans really can't. The Germans, though, are fundamentally screwed.
Are we headed for deindustrialization in Germany? Is that what the road is?
When the Nord Stream pipeline went offline, they lost 40% of their natural gas supply. Even if they were to keep all of their nuclear plants online, that doesn't help them with the petrochemicals that undergird their entire industrial base. So there is no import system that allows them to run their industrial plant on the same price point that they become used to. They're looking at chronically now 7 times prices of what they used to have. And that's an end to Volkswagen. That's the end to the entire industrial model, and there is no way to replace that. They built their entire industry on the globalized post-war environment of access to Russian cheap energy and access to global markets to sell to. They have now aged out. They're aging into mass retirement, so they're losing their workforce. They've lost the energy now, and there's just no coherence to it at all. So we should expect that basically to go away over the next 2 years.